Welcome to Whiskey with a Werewolf Hunter. I'm Brian Easton, author of the Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series, and this is Bulleit Rye, our creature of the night. I looked it up. It is Bulleit, although it's spelled like it's Bulleit. Bulleit Rye, which, as some of you may know, is Sylvester's drink of choice when his, quote, ass hairs are up. Frontier whiskey, whatever that means, but I do like the sound of it. So let's get started. So the last time we went over my Werewolf Hunter series, we pretty much looked at it in one broad stroke. Just a very basic overview was all I really intended for that. But now that we're past that and we get into some more episodes, I want to start going into more detail about the writing and the stories that I have put together in these books. So we're going to look at different aspects of them, about how they were written, kind of my writing process a little bit, and just various plot elements and things like that. So to that end, tonight I want to tell you a little more about myself, a little bit more about my background with writing and werewolves in general. I started writing about werewolves when I was about 10 years old. My mother gave me an old Royal typewriter, which I put a sheet of notebook paper in and started banging away writing stories. And one of the first stories I wrote was about a werewolf. Now, it was like a Wolfman werewolf, because that was the only kind that I had been exposed to up to that time. But of course, as I grew, my writing matured, and I pretty much not stopped in one form or another. But what I want to talk about right now is my background with the occult. In about 1986, I began an in-depth survey into the occult and supernatural phenomena. And this involved a lot of reading, a lot of time spent at the library. This was before the internet. This was when any research you did was hitting the shelves at your college library or your local public library. So I did a lot of that, a lot of late nights in the stacks, down in the basement and up on the top floors, and a lot of photocopies at a nickel a piece. To further my ends in this, I went to college and I obtained a degree in sociocultural anthropology, only as a means of lending some modest credentials to my research, because this is something that I was very into, and I pretty much read nothing else. And so that was my hobby. It was what I did on the side. So during the latter part of the 1990s, after I had graduated from college, I began to do a series of interviews with occult practitioners. They were groups and they were individuals, and they all came from various occult backgrounds, ranging from Wiccan to Rosicrucian. I interviewed a couple of mediums and some self-professed chaos magicians, which were some interesting people. So in my books, if you divine a drift of the paranormal above and beyond the werewolves, that's why I come by it honestly. And we'll talk more about different aspects of the writing as we go along. Now, when we talked about horror last time, the horror genre in general, when we talked about that in our premiere episode, I referred to Stephen King's book, Danse Macabre, and discussed his views on the subject of terror and horror and revulsion and all that. Well, today I'd like to share with you a little of my own views on fear. Several years ago, I wrote a little piece for an online zine, and I don't really remember what it was called now. I think it was like Hollywood Horror or something like that. Anyway, it's gone from the web. But I wrote an article for it entitled "The 10 Fears," and in this article, I took the 10 most classic monsters, as I see it, and related to them a different kind of fear or a different level of fear based on mankind's most basic fears. So these 10 monsters were the Frankenstein creatures, the monster and his bride, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, Phantom of the Opera, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and if I didn't say the Wolfman yet, the Wolfman. My idea was to present this because these monsters, they're frightening, but they don't frighten us for the same reasons. They don't all work at the same level. And so the article did a very basic comparison between the monsters and the fears of mankind. Many of them overlapped, of course, and complemented one another, but just keeping to the nuts and bolts of the thing was what I was wanting to do. I thought maybe someday it would make an interesting book if we could really deep dive it and break it apart. That would be something that I'd be interested in writing if I had the time and the motivation. But for now, I wanted to start talking about these 10 fears as they relate to the classic monsters of cinema. And it's cinema that mostly I'm talking about here. Some are literary characters too, but not all of them. So the vampire is where I started with the article, so that's where I'm going to start tonight. Count Dracula, or there's the vampire in general. So with vampires, literal volumes, and you know this, literal volumes have been written in regards to the vampires and their subtle erotic overtones. That's more of a modern thing, of course, but their effect on the human psyche, nonetheless, has been explored in depth by people much more learned than I. The legends and superstitions about vampires the world over for ages past have left an indelible heritage of horror on us. The world over. I mean, there are vampires in almost every culture out there, and some of them are really strange by Western standards. And the idea of the vampire has also seduced an entire modern subculture who kind of emulate them as gothic anti-heroes, gothic supermen, so to speak. And so I believe that vampires, when it comes to being frightening, the fear that we have of vampires is basically the same kind of fear that we have for evil spirits or the devil, because we fear the vampire like we fear the devil because they both want our souls. Beyond bodily death, there's what comes next. The vampire can take both of those things with one bite, or 3, depending on which tradition you're talking about. So this is an ancient fear, something that wants our soul, something that wants to not just kill us, but to have control over us, to torment us in the world to come. And this ancient fear factors heavily into the roots of religion as well. Man serves his gods to save or at least protect him from a cornucopia of evil spirits and terrors by night. Now, so if you look at it from that point of view, the importance of religious artifacts, the cross, or any kind of a holy symbol that can be used as long as the person believes in it and has faith in it. The symbology there takes on a real significance and becomes pretty obvious of importance. How's the old Scottish prayer go? From ghoulies, ghosties, long-legged beasties, and things that go bump in the night, may the good Lord deliver us. One of my favorites. So he wants our soul, the vampire. wants our soul, wants our blood, but that's not going to end there, is it? Our soul, we're told, is immortal, surviving in perpetuity after we shuffle off our mortal coil. The bite of the vampire, like I said, not only drains the blood, which is the life, but imprisons the soul of his victim inside a living corpse, the undead, with the torments of perdition still yet to come in terms of ultimate, your eternal reward, so to speak. Because now the pearly gates have become unobtainable regardless of how wholesome a person you may have been. So it seems that like the vampire's sting, like death itself, is no respecter of virtue. Now we could, of course, go deeper into this subject and bring up some theological arguments and philosophical points of view on this, but for now we'll just leave it at that. And the first fear of the 10, fear of losing one's soul, goes to the vampire. So speaking of fear of losing one's soul, so it brings me to another aspect of the book that I wanted to talk about, or let's talk shop, as I like to call it, in monster hunting. And in my books in particular, the tagline that I used for Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter, the first volume, was, "It takes more than silver bullets to kill a werewolf." Now, that obviously implies that the hunter requires more than just ammunition. He needs something else. He needs a conviction. What he needs is a perfect willingness to die, to face down. I mean, whether that's out of a sense of duty or fatalism. For Sylvester Logan, it's a simple matter of balance. His hatred for the beast is greater than his fear of it, or his fear of death, or his fear of, going to hell. I mean, he works through that in the books, and he makes that journey. But that's where he's coming from, is that he has the commitment, almost a fanatical devotion to it. And any mortal who hunts something that is not mortal, that is immortal, has to expect consequences much worse than death. Lots of things worse than death. If you don't think so, I'll let you think about that for a while. And so last time we talked, I talked about the monster hunting tradition, or the tradition of monster hunters. I mentioned goes back to ancient times with Marduk, the Sumerian deity, and Beowulf, the Scandinavian hero. And that's true, that they do belong to that order of monster hunters. So do Hercules and Thor and St. George and any number of other gods, ubermen or demigods. But it's not until flesh and blood step up that the game changes. When mortal people step up and take arms against the dark, everything gets kicked up a notch. Now there's more than skin in the game. Because as we've seen, Hercules, Beowulf, these kinds of things, they're the supermen and demigods. They're heroic and they fight the monsters, but what do they really stand to lose? They might get beat up a little bit. No, they're not going to die. I mean, these are immortal type characters, so they're going to be around. But when it's a human being, it's a human monster hunter, whether it's Jonathan Harker or Carl Kolchak, it's going to be more relatable. At least it is to me. It's more relatable because they bleed and they ache and they're afraid and they die, just like I do, just like you do. So it's the human element, I think, in monster hunting that makes it so appealing to me. So we're going to make this a little shorter than we did last week, of course, but I do want us to talk about some of the questions that I received. One of the ones that I picked out for tonight was from Matt on the Facebook page, and he asked kind of a multi-pronged question. He says, what are your choices of whiskey, the influences on your books, your favorite werewolf movies, and your least favorite? So I'll start with the whiskey. We talked a little bit about that, but Tennessee whiskey is my favorite. George and Jack, they're my favorites if I'm going to be picking some out. I like rye, and how could I not? Writing Sylvester. And I like most bourbons, except for the ones that I think are too sweet. I won't name any names, but if you know bourbon, you know the ones that are too sweet. As a rule, I don't keep Canadian, Irish, or Japanese whiskeys at the house. Nothing really against them. I just don't prefer them, and so I don't keep any on hand. Now, I do usually have a single malt Scotch around somewhere, usually a Laphroaig or a Glenfiddich for special occasions. So that's the whiskey. Then they say, what are your influences on your book? Well, there's a multitude of influences. It's a question that a lot of authors get asked, and I have to say that as far as the influences on my writing, as far as Sylvester Logan goes, first among them would be my father. Now, my father is a minister and has been since the day I was born. He's also a horseman and a cowboy from way back, and so he taught me my love of westerns, and he introduced to me different western gunmen, Wild Bill Hickok, and frontier bordermen like Lewis Wetzel. These are all historically, tough guys, good with a gun or good with a hatchet or a tomahawk with their fists, and so these guys get rolled up and put into Sylvester along the way. Somebody asked me about Quincy Morris. I mentioned Quincy Morris last time about how he was my favorite monster hunter, and the person I was chatting with at the time asked me if there was a little bit of Quincy Morris in Sylvester, which I answered, of course, most definitely. Sylvester is the son of many fathers, and Quincy Morris, is no exception. He's got Western type. He's got the Winchester rifle. Yeah, most definitely. But my influences on Sylvester weren't just monster hunters, or then they weren't just Western gunmen either. Fictional characters such as Jonah Hex and the Man with No Name come to mind when I'm thinking about that. And so just getting back to my father briefly, it was his hatred for werewolves that really inspired me to put that into Sylvester, to make a werewolf hunter to begin with. When I was I was maybe 9 years old, and I had gotten a werewolf book and record collection. It was Power Records. It was Marvel's Curse of the Werewolf. And I was in love with it, of course, but my father didn't like it at all. In fact, he hated it. He took it away from me because he saw the werewolf not as I did at the time, as the man born under a curse and a good guy with this terrible burden to carry. He saw them as evil creatures, and I adopted this way of thinking, through him, and he has an animosity toward them, which I couldn't understand at the time, but he's a minister, so if he sees this as some kind of an evil spirit, then he's definitely going to have a grudge against it, isn't he? So those are the influences, some of the influences on Sylvester's character. Now, as far as literary goes, it's the usual suspects. It's H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, Brian Lumley, Algernon Blackwood. Probably the most impactful author on my writing, though, has been Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy, as you may know, the author of such books as The Road, All the Pretty Horses, No Country for Old Men. But his masterpiece is Blood Meridian. And I always mention this in every interview I do, that Blood Meridian is a book that I have read or listened to on audio probably 50 times, and that's not an exaggeration. I love the prose. I love the horror of it. If you don't know what it is, It's a book about American scalp hunters after the Mexican War, traveling through the borders, the Mexican border, and basically taking scalps for money. And it's horrific, and it's beautifully written. And if you can stomach it, I recommend it. If you can't, then I wouldn't even bother. So the last question was about movies, werewolf movies, my favorite and my least favorite. So as The Howling goes, the original Howling, that is probably my favorite werewolf movie, because the transformation was groundbreaking at the time, and it still holds up pretty well. But it has left an impact on me that I can't shake. And also, The Howling features werewolves closest to my own. In fact, that's the way I picture my werewolves looking, like Marcia back here. This is a howling werewolves, and they're also portrayed as being fairly evil creatures. At least I thought so. Not to the extent that I make them, but there's definitely no Lawrence Talbot. So I also love the Wolfman, of course. Speaking of Lawrence Talbot, the first Wolfman for our first werewolf movie that a lot of us ever saw was the Wolfman. And I loved it, and I loved the 2010 remake too. I thought that was, it has its warts, but all things considered, it's one I watch over and over again. So then we get to the my least favorite movies, least favorite werewolf movies. My least favorite werewolf movies are pretty much everything that happened in the Howling franchise after the original Howling, with the possible exception of Freaks, because it had a pretty interesting vampire in it. But to be fair, there are scores and scores of bad werewolf films, and they know who they are, and you probably do too. So it's not really fair. I mean, like I said before, the werewolf is a special effects creature, and if you don't have the special effects, you've got to do it through storytelling, which is very difficult to do when everybody watching the movie wants to see the monster. They want to see that. And if you can't produce that, that nobody's going to watch you twice. Back at the bar for one more before we say goodnight. That is good. You can follow me on Facebook and subscribe to this channel here on YouTube. You can also check out my website at www.werewolfhunter.com. And when we get together next time, I'll have a contest to announce. So until then, thanks for joining me. Good night.